Hey guys, welcome to a new video. In today's video, we're going to look at a Leetcode problem, and the problem's name is count servers that communicate. In this question, we're given a map of a server center represented by a mn to n integer matrix called grid, where 1 means that on that cell there is a server and 0 means that there is no server in that cell. Two servers are set to communicate if they are on the same row or if they are on the same column. Return the number of servers that communicate with any other server. So in this example, we are given a 2D matrix 1 0 and 0 1, 1 0 and 0 1. So ones denote that there is a server. In this case, these two servers can't communicate because for this server there is no server on its row or on its column. Similarly, for this server there is no server on its column or its row. So there are only two servers and neither of them can communicate, so the output is 0. In this case, you can see this server has another server in its same column. This server also has a server on its row and also on its column, and this server also has a server on its row. So 3 of them can communicate, so the count is 3. In this case, you can see these two servers can communicate with each other and these two servers can communicate with each other. This cannot communicate with either of these 4 because there is no server on its row or on its column. So the number of servers are 1, 2, 3, 4, and these 4 can communicate with at least one of them. So the output is 4. Coming to the function given to us, this is the function name. This is the input in matrix grid. We have to return an integer as the output. So let's iterate through the grid and find out for every server in which row it is present and in which column it is present, so that we can have a pre-computed array. So I'm going to create 2 arrays, row count and column count, so that I know in which row how many servers are there and in which column how many servers are there. Now with this pre-computed input, we iterate through the grid again and we check for each server if in that row or in its column there is a server or not. If from that pre-computed array we get the results, if there is at least one more server in its row or in its column, we increment the count, and finally outside the for loop, once we processed all the elements inside the grid, we return that output which we counted. So let's start off by checking if this input grid is null or if it is empty. Then we return 0 as the output. So that will be our base case. So if grid is equal to null or if grid.length is equal to 0, in both cases you can return 0 as the output. Now let's find out the number of rows and the number of columns in this grid. The number of rows, I'm going to store it inside a variable rows. You can find out using the grid.length. And the number of columns, I'm going to store it inside a variable called cols. And I'm going to take the 0th row and find out the length of this row, which will give me the columns. Now let's iterate through the input grid using 2 for loops. The outer loop is for rows. The outer for loop is going to iterate through the rows. So I'm going to take a variable row, and these row will go until the number of rows, that is rows, and row plus plus will give you the next row. Let's do the same for columns. We start with the 0th column until the total number of columns. Now, like I said, we need 2 arrays. So let's declare these arrays outside the for loop. So the first array is going to be row count, which will be of the size of the number of rows. Let's do the same for column count. This is also going to be an array. I'm going to name it col count, which will be of the size of the number of columns. Now inside these for loops, let us check using a if statement that if the current element we are iterating inside the grid, so grid of row and column, is equal to 1, it means it is a server. So for this server, we have its row and its column. So inside the row count, let's update the row. So row count of row. So increment the count for that. And same for this element, we have the column. So for its respective call count, increment the variable. So call count plus plus. Now once this for loop ends, it means we have filled our pre-computed arrays, that is row count and column count. Now let's declare our output variable. I'm going to name it count. Now let's iterate through the grid one more time so that we could process one array at a time and increment our count variable. So again, we start with the 0th row and it goes until the total number of rows. Same for columns. We start with the zeroth column. It goes until the last column. Now again we have to check if the current element we are iterating at, that is grid of row column, is equal to server. So grid of row column, if this is equal to server, now we have to place another check. We have our pre-computed array row count and column count. So now for this element, so if this is a server, so we have a server, it is at row 0 and column 0. So we have to check if in row 0 are there any servers. If in column 0 are there any servers. We can check that from row count and column count. So row count of row. So if row count of row is greater than 1. So if there are any other servers in this row, there is already one server in row 0. That is why we have to check if that is greater than 1 and not greater than equal to 1. There is already 1. We have to check if there are more than 1. Or we have to check in column count for column if it is greater than 1. If either of the case is true, we can increment our count variable. And finally, outside this for loop, we return the variable count, which will be our output. But this has to be call plus plus, right? Because that is our current column. Now let's try to run the code. The test cases are being accepted. Let's submit the code. And a solution is accepted. So the time complexity of this approach is big of m into n, where m is the number of rows and n is the number of columns. The space complexity is big of m plus n, where m is again rows and n is the columns. That's it guys. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.